for being here, for being a part of your classroom and helping your kids and being there every day. I know it's been a tough year, so thank you all. So really quickly, I'm Tyler Rablin. I'm a high school teacher here, a former instructional coach, and I get to do a lot of work with other districts mostly around assessment, which is kind of where this will all head towards. Really thinking about what are we helping kids build towards and how are we providing a path for them to get there. So actually you don't have to grab pieces of paper because there's a sticky note on your table, and my debate kids helped me come up with this. I wanted to illustrate an idea here. So on the next slide, you'll want your device actually. Sorry, I should have told everyone that before you close things. There's two, and so there's three of us, so make sure somebody has A, somebody has B, and then someone else can choose whichever one you want. You're not allowed to peek at the other one. There's an activity where you're going to create this. Where'd it go? There it is. You'll create that, and I'll give you we'll do about a minute unless we need longer. So if you type in, to get to the instructions, you just have to type in this piece right here. So either, if you're doing option B, type in that in a web browser. If you want to do option A, type in that into a web browser. You don't get to know what it's like on the other side. You just will see your own to start with, and then we'll talk about the difference between the two. Once you're on there, you can give me a thumbs up, or I can come help get you in there if you need to. Oh, is it not letting you on?
Oh, there you go.
Okay, sweet. Go. And then actually, I think if you're on there, you can even go and click it. Trying to see which ones we opened. Wait, did you do A or B? A?
A, I can do B.
A? No, that's okay. Do you mind doing B?
I don't mind.
Okay, it'll help illustrate a point here. Okay, did it open for you?
Yes.
All right, here we go. Oh, this is really laggy. This is fun. See if you can do it using the instructions you have in 1 minute. See if you can fold it. We will need it in Rounce's room, I think. That's the only. Actually, yeah, double check. I think we might need it in her room. Wait, I just realized I lied. She has one. We're good. We're good. Yeah. I'll tell you, it's slightly unfair, so don't feel bad if you're getting stuck. I don't know if I muted this timer. It might get really loud in a second. Oh, I did not. Oh, but it's not too loud. We're all right. All right, I know it's half the fun of folding the heart, but you don't have to finish it. Here's what I want you to see. So here's the difference between option A and option B. So option A was on the top. Option B was on the bottom, and option B actually had pictures along the way as a resource to help them learn how to do it. So, and I wanted to start with this to highlight the difference between the two. The one on the top is what we typically regard as a rubric because it's designed to evaluate the performance on a task. It's not necessarily designed like the bottom level to guide someone in the steps along the way to being able to achieve something. So when I talk about HyperRubrics, you hear me use the term learning progressions a lot. Really thinking about, like I used to build rubrics all the time because that's what my teacher prep program taught me, and I know they're important and there is a function for them. But what I had to kind of sit and realize is rubrics are good at helping someone reflect on what they already know how to do, but they don't often help people figure out how to get there. There's not a ton of access points for learners in there. So you'll hear me talk about learning progressions. That's my goal when I think about learning progressions. And today we'll talk about how to unpack pieces of essential learning to build those learning progressions, just to help people see wherever I'm at in the process, where can I start? So fortunately, we are a small group, so we don't have to break out at all. I want you to see some actual real examples of the differences between these two. So again, you're going to need, in a second you'll type in a shortened link. You'll have some time to just look through some of these different, I guess, comparisons between a rubric and a learning progression. And then we'll kind of talk about it together, noticing like, what do we see? And I tried, so if you go here, this is the resource. Again, if you just type this, it should take you there. And then what that'll take you to is you should see a bunch of different options that I tried to get as many different content areas as I could and different grade levels. And I will say most of the people that I asked for ideas were secondary, so they're mostly secondary examples. But what I want you to do, just go through and find one that resonates with something you might teach or something close to what you might teach, so that you can have a second to look through the difference of what these might actually, kind of the final outcome of these. So find one that you like and take a second to kind of notice. You can click through a couple. I want to give you a little bit of processing time to see what they look like. And then we're really going to get into breaking down how do we build them. So with that, give you some time to just sort of click through and check them out. Still have 30 seconds left. In a second, we'll just kind of have a chance to talk about like what stands out to you as you're looking at them. What do you notice as some of the key differences between them? My neighbor has like cameras that make that exact same noise anytime there's motion. So as soon as I heard that, it just reminded me of my neighbor's cameras.
Like, Twitter.
Hope we don't need the timer again. So kind of curious, like as you were looking through those, what did you notice? Were some similarities, some differences? Like what stood out to you with the difference between the two? I'm going to sit for a little bit too.
I noticed that it seemed a lot more positive the way it was worded on the progression versus the bottom, the rubric. I felt like if my daughter, one of my daughters was reading this, it'd make them feel that they made it almost, I can't do this skill yet, but kind of saying I can't versus focusing on, well, maybe not yet, or I don't know, like the wording yet was there, but it just felt to me a little bit more negative at the bottom, the way it was worded, whereas the top made you feel hopeful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that was like one of the first things that made me start rethinking how I was using rubrics is, and we'll talk in a second about like what they're good for and what their function is, but I realized I had to be really careful with the wording because otherwise it really encourages students who are performing towards the top of the rubric. It's like, yeah, I'm doing great, go me. And then a lot of times lower down, it's not helping, all the student is able to identify is what they can't do or what they're struggling with. And so that was one thing that I am still constantly rethinking and working on is, how are we doing? We know confidence and motivation is such a huge piece of students being willing to learn, and if I'm only focusing on the students who are performing well and scaffolding their confidence there, it's really me thinking, how am I building confidence for every kid in my class if I can? Mm-hmm. So yeah, nice observation. Anything else stand out? Yeah.
It looked like whoever put these together really was intentional about doing it with a growth mindset to kind of
yeah, I agree. And because really, I look at the rubric, and this is one of the things that I had to process through. I looked at the rubric, and wherever I would get scored, as a student, I would have a hard time figuring out where I'm going next. Especially a lot of times, still am guilty of this when I'm creating a rubric of it says I make many mistakes to I make few mistakes with this thing. And I'm like, well, if I don't know the thing, I have no idea how I'm going to improve. So that idea of growth mindset of knowing this is the direction I'm heading, I really had to kind of think am I providing that direction for the students? Nice. I want to create space in case there are other comments or responses before I move forward. And follow up, perfect. All right. So here's what we're going to do. So hopefully that I always have a hard time explaining the difference between the two because they look so similar when you just look at them. So hopefully that just helped lay a foundation of these are the differences between the two. So we already did the welcome and interactivity. We're going to dive into some research of what we know about rubrics because I don't want to send the message that rubrics are bad. They are not at all. They just have a specific function that sometimes we overuse. And then we'll really look at, and I know it doesn't sound like the most exciting thing in the world, but unpacking standards in a way that makes it meaningful for kids. I felt not necessarily here, but in previous districts, I was asked oh, we got to unpack the standards. And it was mostly just checking boxes so that administration could say good job, you unpacked the standard, let's move forward and forget about it. And so I really wanted to figure out there is value in that process, but I wanted to think about how do we make it valuable for kids, not just for the teacher who has to do the unpacking. Mm-hmm. So here's some of the, I hope today as you walk away, you'll have a template that might be helpful in terms of thinking about how to unpack standards. But we'll look at how to do that so that we can identify access points to learning. And that's the big thing for me that I'll hopefully say multiple times throughout is how are we creating ways for kids to see where they can start and how they can be successful. Because I know I was not great at building that into rubric. And then we'll look at how do we build the progressions. And finally, the last part that has been really, really in my classroom and has been really helpful in allowing students to take ownership and see how feedback matters and how they can personalize their own instruction is you can take those learning progressions and actually embed teaching resources or wherever they're at. There's a resource right there that helps them figure out this is what I need to learn next so that I can move to that next phase. So that's really the big difference. They have different functions, and so I wanted to look at a couple different things about them. So we looked at that a bunch. And this is what I talked about with, I want to give a picture of this. They're isolated pieces at each step. And for me, that's why I use the term learning progression a lot. It's not good to bad. It's earlier to later, right? What are the first steps in learning this content? And for me, most of the time, we'll talk about how to break it down, but do they even know the terms that we're going to be using to engage in this conversation at all? Okay, so just so that I'm not bashing rubrics, because there is value there, here's some of the good stuff about it. And I think a lot of this is super important, right? There's really good studies on the effects of implicit bias and the outcome of that as it relates to grading. And one of the ways they found to minimize the impact of that is to use rubrics, really well-designed rubrics that the team works around together to make sure that each kid is getting the score that they deserve and that implicit bias has as little of an effect as possible. The other thing, I don't know, there's a really good book called Grading for Equity, and it talks about one of the biggest issues with grading assessments is that a teacher A and teacher B can give wildly different scores for the same thing. And they found that using a well-designed rubric and calibrating around that as a team helps ensure that kids are getting equitable scores no matter which classroom they're in, that, you know, it's not really impacted by the teacher's perspective or opinion of what that student deserves. They can also be really helpful, and I know this is huge, it decreases the amount of time we have to spend giving feedback sometimes, because if a well-designed rubric, now we just have to point, right? We can say, like, this is an area that you need to focus on, this is what you're doing. And then a lot of times, and this is some of the value of the rubrics with students, is it can help them decide whether or not they've really done a quality job of demonstrating their learning with the task. It gives them a space to whether it's self-evaluation or peer reflection, to really talk about that task together. So that's the good with rubrics, but there is a lot of research on actually the bad, the negative. And so one of the things that, and I noticed as I started using rubrics more and more with students, well, the first part, so with feedback, there's something called the cost-benefit ratio, meaning if a student feels like the benefit of using the feedback has too high of a cost, like it's just too much work to use the feedback, they won't use the feedback. And so rubrics often, when we were talking about the lower levels, aren't really clear about how to move forward. If they get feedback and they don't see how to move forward, in their mind, that's too much of a cost. Like they don't know how hard it's going to be to use the feedback, so a lot of times that decreases motivation. The big one for me is it focuses students on the task. And yes, like the task is important, but really I want them thinking about it. Often when I was designing rubrics, it was, here are the boxes you need to check to do well on the task. When really I want to know, how are you in your learning? So rubrics often focus on the tasks as opposed to the learning. Yeah.
Can I take pictures?
Yeah, for sure. And then, you know, the big thing for me that I am constantly trying to work on in the classroom is how am I, like, especially at the secondary level, kids are so much like, I have to turn it in and get the points. You know, like that's pretty much all they care about. And my goal is, how do I help them think about the process of learning? It's not necessarily about the final thing that you make, but the point of that is along the way you're learning. And rubrics oftentimes, because it's a points-based thing so often, it focuses them on, did I do the assignment, did I not, how'd I do on the assignment, as opposed to, did I learn along the way? And it also, I was really guilty of this, like usually it narrowed the scope of how students could demonstrate their learning, right? There were very clear like criteria, this is what you have to do, this is what has to be in there. And sometimes kids just need that open door to say, listen, you have to show me you know X, and now you have different ways that you can do that. And so rubrics can sometimes narrow that a little bit. All right, so again, and for me, this is the difference. Rubrics are for evaluating, right? They're for, at the end of a demonstration, how did you do? And the primary user is typically for teachers. And that's where, as I've been kind of looking through it, that's where a lot of the value is teachers using this to calibrate around what quality looks like in terms of demonstrating their understanding. But for me, learning progressions are now the primary piece that I use in my classroom with students, because they are the primary user, right? Like if you look at how it's a very student-facing thing that says this is phase 1 of this learning process, this is phase 2, so kids can really figure out where they fall on that timeline, for lack of a better term, because that's really what it is for me. Okay, so I don't want you to walk away, I don't want you to walk away with just something that applies to my class. And I want to give you a second, if you've got a unit coming up or something coming up and there's a standard in your curriculum, I don't know why I keep clicking, take a second, find a standard that would be like useful for you to process through this with, so that it actually applies to your classroom, not just a general idea. Yeah, okay if I play a little music while we work independently during the session?
No worries. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
I don't know how loud this will be. Oh, it's just coming out of my computer. So yeah, you can, I mean, find anything you want, any standard that you might be working with coming up. Just so I can get context a little bit. What's your name?
Monica, I work at Chief Jamaican.
Okay, what grade level?
Third.
Third,
Third
okay.
grade. Mhm.
Okay, my wife's at Chief Jamaican.
Yeah.
And Kevin, I know what you teach.
I'm Lori Gwynn. I teach at Harrison, 6th grade.
Cool, okay, what content?
ELA, social studies.
Oh, sweet. Oh, that's right, I forget you get a humanities block. I'm so jealous.
Yes.
I don't know why high school just decided that wasn't important anymore. I know it's got its pitfalls for sure, but
I actually like it because it kind of gives up my baby a little bit for you.
good.
It's
Lori. Lori.
Lori, kind of nice to meet you. So do you guys get 3 minutes or is it?
No, we're down, we did an hour. We're down to hour.
Oh, okay.
And I have 6 periods now. So
Oh.
I teach 2 ELAs and 2 social studies
Oh.
and an enrichment class.
That's cool.
Wow. How are you doing? Did you find one?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
But
Kevin?
to be honest, I liked our 90-minute blocks.
I love 90-minute blocks.
Because I'm really having a hard time adjusting to the hour.
Yeah.
Like, it's amazing how that 30 minutes really changed things.
And especially like reading, writing. I feel like the 90 minutes is so nice
Well,
to
in
have.
writing, I mean, I have 6, I mean, I teach 6th grade, and they just need, I don't feel like I have the time to do the, I show you, we do it, you do it.
Yeah.
Unless I really rush through my part, which does help them do their part of it.
Yeah. I'll show you half, you do half, and then go.
Yeah. And I'm moving on now. So, yeah.
Nice.
But yes.
Okay. And then, Monica, did you find one?
Yes, I did.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll walk through this process. And this is how I found it to be. I'm going to kind of hopefully give you the version that has become helpful for me. And here's the reason why processing standards has become so important. Like if I look at this standard, which is one of the ones that we teach, and think about what I have to actually focus on and what students need to learn, like all of these things pop up for me. So it's not just one standard then that I'm playing with, but now I've got at least 5 different skills or concepts that students need to be aware of, at least to even be able to engage in that standard. And here's the other reason why, like there's a ton of stuff per standard, but the other thing that is rough for me, this is the number of standards that 910 ELA is supposed to cover. And there's research that looked into how long it takes to cover a standard, and I would argue that that's not even necessarily students learning the standard, it's just covering it. They say it's 5 hours to cover a standard, which means it's 205 hours, and we don't have, like, it's impossible. Like it's an impossible challenge. And so some of the terms that I'm going to use, and so when we talk about standards, for me, that's not necessarily something we're always assessing, but processes we engage in. Like if you look at some of the standards around writing, it's about, are they using technology to produce their writing? I'm not going to assess it. Like that's not something that I'm going to assess. Did you use Google Docs well? Like that's not, it's just a process that we're engaging in, and the standard helps us figure out like what are we doing? What do we do as a class? The piece that starts to get really important to me are the power standards, and I know a lot of content areas have already broken those down, so we won't spend a ton of time talking about how to identify those today, but I will give a couple tips if it would be helpful for your team. The big pieces that we'll talk about are, I call them essential learning, right? And it's that idea that if you look at that character development standard, there are about 5 pieces of essential learning in there. And for me, isolating those has become really helpful in figuring out what do students need to know to be able to engage in that process. And then the last piece is the learning progression, where you put the essential learning essentially together and start looking at where do we start with this? Like if a kid has never heard this concept before or missed all of last year and was never on their Zoom, like where do they start? So, did I go too fast? Okay, yeah, okay. So I do have, there's a template that I found really helpful. This link's a little bit longer. I always try to shorten them more, but it's in there, the gg.gg/unpacktemp. It should open a version. You can make a copy so that you've got your own to edit and mess with and do whatever you want as we go through this. Oh, and we're gonna have to fly. All right, I'll try to be efficient as we go through it. I do this all the time during class. I start playing music and then I forget that it's playing while I'm talking and I'm like, oh, I probably should have stopped that.
Yeah, it's like louder.
Rather soothing.
I'm thinking, okay, need more coffee.
I have playlists for different classes. Like my first period gets the upbeat playlist because they're just waking up. My fourth period gets this every day. Just calming, relaxing music every day for fourth period.
My third and fourth period are like, oh.
Yeah, I was talking, one of our principals was saying fourth period across the board for our younger grades for some reason is just like rough for everybody.
Say that my class has been raised by wolves because they just have no idea. They're just kind of out there. And I love the pieces, but they're just like the ones I've really had to.
Yeah.
You could do a literature study or film study in the Jungle Book.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, they're awesome kids. They just.
Let's see. Okay, so if you've got that standard you chose, if you want to, or I would really encourage you, copy and paste that into the top box on the template. And if you need help making a copy so you can edit it, let me know. I can come around and help make copies. Got it, guys. Sweet. All right, once we've got it copied, are we good? You got it in there? Okay. Again, that quick note about power standards, that we're going to skip that box for today. But if your team is, I feel like everyone this year is trying to figure out with what's happened the last year and a half, what do we really need to cover? There's 3 rules for identifying power standards that I really have been helpful for me. So that's endurance, meaning how much of an impact will this have beyond the classroom, like in the real world? How valuable is this skill? There's leverage, meaning, like the one that I'm using in the example of character development applies in English, maybe applies in some social studies, but you're not necessarily doing that in science or in math, versus something like supporting your claim with evidence. That's going to be useful across the board. So that would rank higher in leverage. And then lastly is readiness, meaning if you're talking vertically, like from grade to grade, do students need this skill to be successful next year? So again, I don't want to spend too much time on these, but this has been helpful for me in really clarifying, like, what do I need to be focusing on this year, especially with my kids? But so now that you have a standard, here's the process that I walk through. So we'll analyze the standard, separate out the essential learning, identify the concepts that are kind of built into that essential piece of learning, and then you sequence them out to make that learning progression. So here's the first step with analyzing the standards. Did I skip a slide? Or did I put it in a different spot? I did. What I've started doing is anytime I have a standard, I highlight the verbs in green because that tells me the skills students need to be engaging in, and the nouns in blue. Because almost always that tells me the skills they need and the content they're supposed to learn. Which has been, like, especially with something as overwhelming as this, being able to separate those two out, the skills they need versus the content that they're going to learn, helps me sort of scaffold that instruction so that we can focus on the content they need to be able to engage in the skills. So I would encourage you to try it with yours. Any sort of verb, so any sort of action they're supposed to be doing, if you highlight that in green, and then any sort of noun, highlight that in blue, and that'll help separate out the skills and the content they need to learn. So if you want to take a second, you can also, if you want to like call me over, I can peek at it too, just because it's something I have done a lot. Let me know when you feel like, okay, I got it, I'm ready to move on. Just let me know. I like this small group because I can pace it however we need to.
Yeah, I'm looking just for a little quick.
Yeah. Explain, got it. Key details, main idea. Yeah, I feel like you identified the key stuff in there. The only other one you could is determine,
I thought about that, but then I thought,
but it's almost like,
how do I?
what are you teaching there? You
Yeah.
know, like what's the skill? Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's what I would have done too. I
Okay,
would have skipped
okay.
it.
So I thought myself on that one too. I was like,
I know, sometimes I just highlight them all at first and then I kind of like, I'm like, okay, that's not a skill we're really going to teach because I don't
Yeah,
know,
okay.
determine. Like, I don't know what I'm teaching if they're just determining, so.
It's funny that you said that because yep.
Yeah, yeah. Support, claims, reasons, evidence, sources, topic. Yeah, those ELA standards. There's just so much in every single one. I mean, all the standards. And it's, like, I feel like, and that's why I view them as these are processes we engage in. Because if I just look at it as a whole and think I need to teach this, it's like, that's too much. Like, that's just so overwhelming versus breaking it apart. Like, in this example, if I go back, there we go. Like complex characters. Okay, like that is a straightforward skill that I can teach that we'll use to build into this process. Okay, so that's step one, is just analyzing it. And then step two is really thinking about what's the essential learning built into that. So like this one, I really found three. Right? They need to understand types of characters, analyze how they develop, and analyze how they impact the message of the text. Like those, to me, if I were to take this and really break it apart and use like a fine-tooth comb to say, what are the things that they really need to be learning with this? Those are the ones that I would identify. So, and you'll see sometimes they fold into each other, which this one will. But here's what I would try. The green section on that, see if you can go, like now that you've broken apart the standard, see if you can identify what's like the 2 or 3 big pieces of essential learning that students need to be able to do as they're engaging in this standard. This is one of the hardest steps for me because I feel like I have so many things that I want to put in there, but really thinking about, and I'll put the example back up there. Yeah. Yeah, so that might be helpful to see as you go. Like really like fine tooth, like this is the skill, the one thing we're going to be engaging in. And this is the time that sometimes I just have to cut things out. Like if I end up with way too many pieces of essential learning, it's like, okay, 2 or 3. If I can limit it to 2 or 3, that's manageable. And then, yeah, feel free if you want me to peek at it, just let me know. And for this, if you don't want to try to identify all of them, you could just see if you can pull one out. Like, what's one piece of essential learning kids need to engage in and get?
Got two.
Got two? Nice.
If you don't mind looking.
Yeah,
I was like,
not at all.
I was trying to shoot for 3, but then I thought, keep it simple maybe.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out how to word key details without saying key details again. Say key details.
You could put it in there. Like,
Okay, instead of evidence, because I was trying to figure out,
yeah,
what is it?
I always flip back and forth between those two. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know why. So, yeah, retell good, and then explain the evidence that supports it. Good. Yeah. Yeah. I would say that's for sure the two big pieces of essential learning. Yeah. Nice. The poor ELA standards.
Yes. But I think this one right here they're usually pretty good about making the claim even though they may not word it correctly.
Yeah. Yep.
But the evidence to support their claim is like, woohoo!
Yep.
We're doing explanatory right now.
Yeah.
It's
What
like,
did she say?
Yeah, 6,
Yeah.
right? 6?
yeah.
Okay, so,
Support your claim with clear reason and relevant evidence using credible sources and demonstrating an understanding of topic or fact.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah, I feel like
we're
it's.
doing explanatory right now, and it's like, so the destruction has caused the death of many people, and then for their evidence, they gave me the definition of a tsunami. It's like,
Yeah.
there's all this evidence in there that says it killed 139,000 people, and you picked the definition of a tsunami.
yeah. When you said that, well, 3rd grade, it's good to hear that 6th grade is also battling with those.
Yeah.
They battle with
Third
it.
grade.
Yeah. Okay, do we feel like we've got at least one piece of essential learning we could work with? So this is where, these first 2 steps I feel like are, when we talk about unpacking standards, this is usually where we stop, right? Like we just look at the standard, figure out what they're learning, and then stop there. But it's the next couple steps that have turned this into something that's helpful for me in my instruction, but also something I can use with kids. It helps if I'm on the right thing. There we go. Nope, not happening. There it is. So take one of those pieces of essential learning and really think backwards. What is everything that they need to know to start engaging in that? So like my example is analyze how characters impact the message of a text. And even going as far back for me as like, do they know what conflict, what theme, what characterization? Like I always think like, what are the things that I assume they know, right? Like, and I start there because I think about for so many of our kids, like as a freshman English teacher, I'm like, oh, they definitely learned this in middle school, and I skip it, when really there are a lot of kids that need that to be an important step in that process.
I think when I look at these standards, in a perfect world where they're all getting all that information every year, then we would be able to just take this and run. But because that's not how life works.
Yeah.
They don't get all those early on. So I am, like, a sentence in 6th grade sometimes is like, woohoo, hello.
Yeah.
You should have learned that, but but reality is, that's a wrap.
Yeah, and like this process, I think that's why it's been most helpful for me is like, I used to just be frustrated because I would have my plan of like, we're going to learn this. And then I'd be like, oh, shoot, you don't know this. And so now we can't. And so this process of like, okay, I want to teach this. I want this to be what they learn, and really thinking through like, let's go all the way back to 2nd grade. Like what do I assume they learned in 2nd grade that we might need to have on a progression so that a kid who doesn't know that, if they don't know what a noun and verb is, is that on the progression so that they can see that access point to the learning. Like, I have a place on this progression. I'm not left out.
I think a big part of that is giving ourselves, I just dealt with this last week, of just giving ourselves permission to be like, okay, stop,
Yep.
do it again.
Yep.
They didn't get it, so it doesn't make any sense to go on. Like giving yourself permission to just stop and like slow down the process.
Yeah.
Go.
Yep. Absolutely.
And it's not a failure, it's just when the kids are asking, that's what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that way. That's even as far as vocab. I assumed the student knew what a pillowcase was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Reading the story to them about the monster who was in the closet. Turns out the cat was in the pillowcase. And when I went to give the punchline, or to, because he heard all these noises, the scratching, we're creeping, and we're going to the closet. Big brother's gonna open the closet, and then in there is the pillowcase. Brother picks up pillowcase, gives it to the young boy. He looks. It was my cat in the pillowcase. And then the student, what's a pillowcase? Lord, it's third grade, but I just thought,
Yeah.
maybe they just, he lives with grandma, so I don't know that grandma would, he probably knows what it means in Spanish.
Yeah, I was going to say, she
Right?
probably just uses a different word, and
yeah.
yeah. Huh.
So that right there not that, I just thought, wow, I didn't even think to introduce that vocab, I just assumed, like you said, that he would have known that. So
Yeah.
I like this backwards thinking, because then, going back to the beginning, even if it means kinder or first.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of times we feel pressured not to do that, because like,
Time.
it's got to,
constraints.
time constraints. And actually, that's why I love these. When we get to the final step, I'll show you my favorite part of this whole process and what it ends up as. But, I like just making sure I'm asking the question, what am I assuming they know? I think I know.
Well, we're told we have to get so far.
Yeah.
Yep,
So
you should be
we've got
multiplying
the
by
pressure
now.
on us.
Yeah. But like,
Yeah.
if there's no first floor or second floor, we're not building the third floor. It's just, logistically, it can't happen that way.
Yeah.
How are we doing with kind of trying to think backwards through this? And if you get to a spot where we might have to rush a little bit here at the end, so don't feel like if you've only got a couple, that's awesome. Oh, I forgot to put this up here while you're working on it. These are some of the questions I ask myself to help me identify these pieces as I'm thinking backwards. Like, what terms or words do they need to know? Like, just simply, can they engage in the conversation around this skill because they have the vocab they need? Again, we talked about this a lot. What do I assume? Like, if I'm going to ask them to develop compound sentences, I'm assuming they know what a subject and verb are, or what an independent clause is. So what am I assuming they know going into it? What are pieces they need to connect, and what do they need to do to be able to apply the skill? All right, and I'm gonna have to hustle a little bit to get through the end of this. So sorry if you didn't get all the way through this, but I mean, I would, if this process ends up being valuable to you, part of the reason I wanted you to have your own copy of this template is it can be really, really helpful to do with a colleague or with your team if they're open to it, because it helps me better understand the actual thing that I'm teaching if I go all the way back to where it starts. So for me, the process, you've got the standard, break it down, find the essential learning, and then think backwards through that. And then really, now you're going the other direction of trying to build it up into this progression. And the best way that I can kind of wrap my brain around it is really thinking about it in terms of blooms. And like that, the first couple levels are, what do they need to just remember and understand? The facts, the words, the terms, like what do they just, that background knowledge and content they need to know? And then as it moves up, it's what are the skills or processes they might be doing to use that information and use that knowledge? And part of the reason I like this is this gives everyone a common foundation. I used to always just assume, like, I can identify conflict. I assumed my kids all knew what conflict was. And if I moved ahead too quickly without putting a space for that, that's where I think I am guilty of leaving kids out or leaving kids behind with that assumption. And the other thing I want to point out about the progression, each step is like actually a separate thing they can learn. So it's not necessarily like, With a rubric, usually what happens is this is the access point. This is the one thing they're learning. And then this is, they didn't do that very well, and this is, they did do it really well. Versus a progression asks, like, what is something they're learning at each step along the way that builds on each other? And then this is where, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This is where it starts to get pretty fun. Although actually, I feel like this is important to stop and address. For me, this is really how I think through the different phases. So stage 1 and 2 are just, what are the background elements I assume they've learned that they need for this? Making sure I have space for those. 3 is, what's the new content I'm planning on introducing? 4 is, what are they doing to apply the content? 5 is, how are they combining that into a complex skill? And so if you go, like if I go back to the one I just had, like this one right here, these are the things like, what am I assuming that they already know? I'm assuming they know protagonist and antagonist. I'm assuming they know conflict. And so I want to make sure that gets its own spot. This would be something new I'm going to teach. Methods of characterization. This is how they're going to apply it. And then on the far right is, how are they connecting it with something else? Really just thinking through like how our brain builds a complex understanding. We have to know the pieces first. Then we have to think about, how does it apply, how do we use it, and then how does it connect to the rest of the things that we're learning. So the final step in this, and this is where really I feel like it becomes something that's valuable for my kids in the moment. Shoot, we don't have time to talk through the feedback, but actually I had to last minute add another session, which is next, about feedback. But some of the things we know about feedback, the quicker they can use it, the better. It has to be focused on a goal. The term that I love seeing in the feedback research is called advisement, where it's really talking about, it's not saying here's what you did wrong, but it's focused on here's the next thing you need to do, so that kids see the use of it. And then really the goal is effective feedback builds their ability as a self-regulated learner. Not necessarily me saying, hey, go fix that one thing, but really saying this is something you need to learn. Here's a resource to go learn that. And so this is how the HyperRubric helps. I don't know if you've heard the term HyperDocs, but see, I mean, it's nothing fancy. It's the idea of a document with links on it that helps guide students through a learning process. Once we've built this learning progression, the piece that I love is now I can go in and link resources. So if a student gets feedback that says, hey, this is what you're working on right now, they don't have to wait for me to develop a lesson and teach a small group and go through that. I can give them feedback. They can watch this video and resource, and now it's not a full lesson. It's not as good as a specific, individual instruction, but it does help them see, I know where I'm going next. Right? And I think for me, that was the hardest part with rubrics is I would give kids feedback that said, here's how you did on the task. And it was really hard for them to figure out where am I going next? And so all they were focused on is, here's where I am now, right? And yes, it's important, but I want them focused on here's where I'm going next. And I think I have, this one is a little more complicated and my kids are giving me feedback on it now. But this idea that helping them see that this is like, it goes together. It's not saying you're bad because you're at a level 2. It's helping them see, no, this is a skill that connects to, and builds to this skill and builds to this skill with resources all along the way. And it's been helpful for me, like differentiation is really hard because there's so many different levels and it's such a time commitment to try to address that. And while this isn't like full-blown differentiation, a lot of times what I do now is if students get feedback on a piece of writing, half of Friday right now is just basically asynchronous learning time. And so I give feedback on something like this and I say, figure out what you need to learn next and start using your resources to help you learn it. And kids have started to grab onto that pretty well. And it's really cool to see where before, any kid who's like at this first level, it was almost stigmatized and it was hard for them to be willing to engage in the learning. But now to say, hey, this is where you're at. Look, there's a resource. You're going to move up. Like you're not stuck there. You're going to be able to get better. I've seen a lot more of all my students more interested in it because it's a specific lesson geared towards exactly what they need. But especially students that are typically on the lower end of a rubric are way more willing to engage because they don't feel stuck. Like they can see that path and they know exactly like, this is where I'm at now, and let's just try the next step. Versus we talked about like the cost benefit thing. A lot of times a student who scores here on a rubric, when this is the only goal on the rubric, they view that as too much of a cost and possibly that they can't get there. And so being able to stage it out like this with baby steps. Like you don't have to learn the whole thing now. Learn this next, and that's going to build to this and build to this. So here just like, these are the questions that for me, what got me thinking about learning progressions and rethinking rubrics. Really, am I creating access points for all my learners? When I create a rubric, usually there's one access point. Can you do this thing or not? And here's the levels of whether or not you can do it. Not necessarily saying, here's where you start. You know, for everybody in the classroom, here's where you can start learning this. The other thing, and we caught this early on, how am I scaffolding confidence? That's been one of the biggest things I've been reading and studying recently is the effect of confidence on students' motivation and ability to learn. And I've never thought about it in terms of scaffolding, but how am I building that confidence for students? There's something called the competence confidence loop. But the idea of if we can help a student do something that they're successful at, it builds their confidence to try the next thing. And that's really, with the learning progressions, that's what I really wanted to get to is, yeah, maybe step one is just learning the definitions of something. But if I can show the kid, like, hey, look, you just did that. You're now competent in that. That hopefully starts building that confidence to try the next step. And if they can be successful there, it builds the confidence to try the next one. And then, I won't read through all these, but these are really the big questions that, you know, I don't think the HyperRubric or learning progressions are the only way to do it, but I do think they're super helpful in really helping kids see where am I at now and what's my path to success, because I don't think all of our kids can see that with rubrics sometimes. All right, almost 11:30 right on the dot, and lunch is like always the hard deadline that I will never go into, so thank you again. Feel free if you start working on these and just want to send one to me. You can use my school email or that's my personal one. But really, truly, thank you. I know this wasn't the most wow, tech savvy thing, but for me, it all coming back to fundamentals is always where good teaching starts. And so breaking down standards and building those progressions is a great place. So thanks for coming. It was nice to get to interact and hang out with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
With that, lunch it's just right downstairs. And actually, I think that those stairs will get you there fastest. So,
Okay.
All right.
You set it up nicely with the pictures on the beginning intro.
Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Made it look like, okay, well, there's pictures, you know?
Yeah, good.
That kind of,
I was talking with my debate class, and I was like, hey, and I was like, you know those learning progressions? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, I need some way to help people understand the difference between rubrics and learning progressions.